In response to the jury's findings almost a year ago in the Russell Lopes lawsuit against the city of Brockton, I decided to take several courses of action simultaneously. One was to hire the Collins Center, part of the McCormick School of Public Administration at UMass Boston, to come in as a consultant. They consult with over 100 Massachusetts municipalities, and to have them not just look at the issue of hiring practices and possible discriminatory hiring practices, but actually look at our entire personnel operation from top to bottom, and to offer recommendations for changes, to identify any issues or problems that they find, and to help us look at the entire personnel function from top to bottom, including policies, practices, protocols, procedures. Simultaneously, the city solicitor retained an appellate attorney, Stan Caston, is that his name? Stan? Yeah.
Leonard Caston.
Leonard Caston, to handle the city's appeal that we are currently pursuing, and we did bring in different counsel to handle the appeal than the counsel that had represented the city in the original case. And then the third action that we took is we retained attorney Walter Prince and his firm, Prince Lobel, to conduct their own independent investigation, focusing on the allegation, the Lopes lawsuit of retaliation, and in addition to that, any possible misuse of code enforcement by the city as a tool for retaliation. And I specifically asked him to look for any possible misconduct by city employees that could be related to any of that. So today, we're releasing the report. Walter's firm, along with Dan Tarlow, has completed their report. We're releasing it to the public today. It has been reviewed by the city solicitor. I've had an opportunity to review it, and we're releasing it to the public today. And I think the document pretty much speaks for itself. It's a very thorough, independent look at whether the city participated in retaliation against Mr. Lopes because he had appeared in the newspaper in an article critical of the city's hiring practices. And I'll let the attorneys explain their own findings, but it clearly comes to the conclusion that they just didn't find evidence of that, which I'm actually relieved. The report brings up some questions in my mind, but I think it answers a lot of questions that people have had. So that's my preface. Phil, do you want to add anything?
No, I think that covers it all. I think
Okay.
in the report certainly covers everything.
So this is Attorney Walter Prince, Attorney Dan Tarlow, and they were primarily responsible for the preparation of the report. So they've agreed to join me here today to answer any questions that you may have.
Could you first just explain the conclusion of the report?
We were asked by Mayor Carpenter to conduct an investigation. I myself and my partner Dan Tarlow conducted this particular investigation. We interviewed witnesses and we looked at documents. The question for us was whether or not there was retaliation, and if there was, who was responsible. Through the interviews and reviewing the documents, we found evidence to show that there was no retaliation. In fact, there was a history of complaints by a neighbor against Mr. Lopes that resulted in city officials going out to investigate on the day after the article appeared in the Enterprise. That in and of itself results in no evidence in my mind of a retaliatory motive. People may want to speculate, but our job is not to speculate. Our job is to follow the evidence and look at the logical conclusions that flow from the evidence, and that's what we did in this report.
So I think I just had some factual questions, and also I just wanted to question those, the evidence that you used in the conclusions. Can you tell me how much your firm was paid for this report and how many hours you put into working on it?
I didn't keep track of it, but I'm sure that the city can provide that information.
Can anyone tell me how much this cost the city
It was approximately $68,000.
for this component, this, about the retaliation?
The report,
Or is there
this
more
report.
reports to come after this?
No, this is it.
There was no similar report done on the employment discrimination claim?
That's what the Collins Center is looking at.
Okay.
So that report is probably, they're telling, probably still a couple months away, but you gotta understand, what we've asked the Collins Center to do in terms of the personnel department is broader in scope, because I didn't wanna look just at hiring practices and specifically just Mr. Lopes's instance. I think one of the questions the community has asked of me is to ensure that we don't have any institutional biases that affect hiring decisions, and to make sure that we're using the best practices, that we've adopted best practices as they would be used in other cities similar to Brockton. So in essence, you know, what we're asking the Collins Center to do is really a complete top to bottom examination of the personnel department. And what we expect for them will be a report that I believe and hope will contain a whole series of recommendations regarding that. But we did, as part of the Collins Center, we did ask them specifically to look at hiring practices. And on the Collins Center team that's reviewing Brockton is the UMass Boston's Chief Diversity Officer, who has extensive experience in that area.
So you mentioned the neighbors' complaints and how you believe this shows that this was not a retaliatory response to send the code enforcement task force to Mr. Lopes' home. But wasn't a lot of this information presented at the trial, that there was these ongoing complaints from a neighbor?
I was not the trial counsel, I was not present during the trial, so I can't fully answer that.
But do you think you saw something that the jury didn't see to lead you to a different conclusion?
I can't say whether, excuse me, I can't say what was in the jury's mind. I can only tell you, based upon the evidence that we found in this investigation, that we reached this particular conclusion.
Yeah, and Mark, I would refer you to page 26, where 25 and 26, where they kind of, I think, answer your question very specifically. And page 26 contains 4 different areas of evidence that was discovered by Attorney Prince and his firm during their investigation that was not presented during the trial.
Right, I guess my question is, not a lot of this particular information specifically may have not been introduced. The idea that the neighbors were complaining was introduced, I believe, at the trial. So I'm just trying to understand how it is that there could be a different conclusion than what the jury had,
Well,
given all the
well,
evidence.
As I pointed out in the report, there were people that were not called, and there were documents that were not presented. And we spoke to those individuals, and we looked at those documents, along with talking to other individuals. And that's how we arrived at the conclusion, and it's here in the report.
And is the conclusion essentially that it was a coincidence that the task force showed up at Mr. Lopes' home after he'd been making complaints about racial discrimination in the city's employment system?
Yeah, the evidence shows that the weekend before the Enterprise released the article, the neighbor contacted the task force complaining about Mr. Lopes. And since there was no overtime, the task force did not go out that weekend. The following week, just before the Enterprise released the article, the neighbor called City Hall. And City Hall asked the task force to go out and investigate. So the neighbor complained before the article came out, and There was a call to City Hall, and City Hall responded the same day, requesting that the task force go out and investigate. That's how we arrive at part of the conclusion that there was no retaliation here as a result of the Enterprise article.
Well, do you
being
have a
released.
timeline of the development of the Enterprise article and when the city was informed of that the Enterprise article was in progress?
Well, I think the issue here that I took from this, Mark, is that one of the things that this report does document, Exhibit C, is an email from the mayor's chief of staff to then Lieutenant Williams the day before that documents the call from the neighbor and the specific complaint that there was a truck up on blocks being worked on over the weekend. So I think that's a very important piece of correspondence that unfortunately the jury did not get to see, but I think it clearly
It
speaks to
demonstrates
the.
a paper trail. It shows a trail.
Where did Ken Thompson get the message to that there was a problem at Mr. Lopes' home?
According to Mr. Thompson, he was requested to look into the matter. He placed a call to, he sent an email to the task force asking them to investigate.
Who
Where
made that
he,
request to him?
we're not clear, we don't know. And he did not remember.
Could it have been Mayor Linda Balzotti?
It could have been. We don't know. And we sought to interview Mayor Balzotti, but she didn't participate.
It could have been from a department head, because the calls from the neighbor were issued to the Board of Health, to the building department on numerous occasions, and to the mayor's office via Ken Thompson. So we're not quite sure where that emanated from, but there was a point in time where there's a barrage of complaints and telephone calls from the neighbor complaining about the neighbor. Complaining about the other neighbor, Mr. Lopes.
There's also, I think, Mark, when you have a chance, if you look at some of the information that's provided in the report regarding their interview of Ken Thompson, I think he has a very clear and straightforward and forceful response to the allegation.
Do you want to comment on it?
Well, I
Yes.
believe Ken specifically said he doesn't believe it was the mayor who gave him that instruction, but, you know, I think as you noted, he didn't have a clear memory on exactly who asked him to make sure that someone addressed the neighbor's complaint. But his recollection was it wasn't the mayor.
But he didn't rule it out.
No, he did not rule it out.
But this, what the report does document is that this was one in a long, ongoing series of similar complaints from the
Dating back
same
to
neighbor against the Mr. Lopes.
2010.
Right, so there was a long track record of complaints from one specific neighbor against Mr. Lopes, and that's all documented in here.
I mean, I read the transcripts. Whether I read every page of every day, but I think I read the stuff that relates to this issue. I'd say there was some information, not a lot of information. Certainly none of the documentary information. Ken Thompson didn't testify, and I think so. I think there was some information, but not a lot of information, and not much emphasis.
So if Ken Thompson testified, you think that would have, ended up in a better situation for the city? I mean, couldn't he have been cross-examined and it couldn't have ended up in a worse penalty for the city?
That's why it's sort of speculative as to how things would have been different. All I can say is that there was evidence that we found that was not presented to the jury. How that would have turned out, I don't know.
I think there's two key interviews in this report, Mark, that were not presented at the trial. I think it's Ken Thompson that we're talking about now, and this report references Ken's statement very clearly and emphatically that the mayor did not direct him to retaliate against Mr. Lopes, and he even goes on to say that had he ever been asked to do that, he would have resigned. He would not have done it, he would have resigned. I think it's a really strong statement from a really credible witness. And, you know, another interview in here in this report is retired Fire Chief Richard Francis, who goes on in quite a bit of detail about the circumstances around that visit to Mr. Lopes' home. And, you know, I think, you know, Chief Francis is somewhat critical of the manner in which the city, that code enforcement task force was operating at the time. I think he's critical of that and says he didn't really agree with it at the time. I think he acknowledges that in that visit, when Lieutenant Williams knocked on the door and didn't get an answer, Williams testified that he then walked around into the backyard, and Chief Francis says that he shouldn't have done that. He finds fault with that. However, when you get to the crux of this matter here, he's also adamant that this was not retaliation. He did not allow that type of thing to go on. There was no question in his mind that it was not retaliatory. And he also talks about the fact that he reached out to Mr. Lopes afterwards seeking a meeting in which he wanted to personally apologize to Mr. Lopes, and Mr. Lopes declined to meet with him. So the interview with retired Chief Francis, and the interview with the former Chief of Staff, Ken Thompson, and some of the physical evidence that they discovered in the form of emails, I think that it's very convincing, and it's convincing to me. And I'm not a lawyer, and I wasn't involved in the trial, and this all happened years before I was the mayor. But in retrospect, I wish the jury had had a chance to hear those things, because I think it may have changed the outcome.
Are you not skeptical at all about the role of your predecessor in, you know, in this complaint at the home and sending someone there? Or,
Well,
I mean, I know she didn't want to
yeah,
talk about it, but
yeah, so I think I'll give you a couple reactions. One, I'm disappointed that the former mayor chose not to cooperate either with the defense of the city or the Prince Lobel report. I think that she had an opportunity that she could have really helped set the record straight, and we didn't benefit from her using that opportunity. But I do think people that have been around the city also know that she did have some sort of personal relationship with the complainant, and that, you know, it would not be unusual for the mayor receiving those types of complaints with someone she knows that she's friendly with, to refer it to someone at the Code Enforcement Task Force to go out and check on it. Now, that's a lot of inference in there, because former Mayor Balzotti chose not to respond to numerous requests for interviews. But I mean, I do think I think Ken Thompson in his acknowledges that the complainant and the mayor knew each other, and he also talks about this being one in a long series of similar complaints from the same neighbor against Mr. Lopes.
what about the perception in the community of this case, and code enforcement and the mayor's office's role in code enforcement? Does the mayor's office take complaints about code enforcement and send out people to inspections still?
Yeah, so I think that we do it very differently now. We do it more formally with more people at the table. I think that in this report, there is criticism of the code enforcement task force, what were they called?
Yes, Code
Task
Enforcement
force.
Task Force.
The code enforcement task force that was operating at the time. There's criticism of it from Chief Francis. There's also criticism of it from former Councilor at Large Stewart. When I ran for mayor in 2014, I shared their viewpoint. I thought it was heavy-handed, I thought it was overly weighted towards enforcement action as opposed to education first. I had some personal experience working in outside code enforcement for the Board of Health for a couple of years, and my approach had always been to try to work with residents and business owners and educate them in what the ordinance and codes are that you're required, and working with them to get to compliance and only using enforcement as a last resort. And that's always been my philosophy, and that's the philosophy I brought when I got here. But I don't think that's the way things were being done back in 2010 and 2011. And so that's why we changed things when we got here. So we now have a quality of life task force that meets with me every Thursday morning and involves, I don't know, maybe 10 different city agencies, and we all discuss complaints and properties together, all in front of each other, and with my directing of that, of everyone there as to who will handle what complaint and in what manner, and the law office is part of that, and offering legal advice in situations that come up, and I think it's been very effective and far different than the way it was done back in 2010 and 2011.
And what's your message to people in the community who are concerned that, or at least perceive that, and perhaps due to this case, that racism has been in City Hall in Brockton, city government in Brockton throughout the years?
Yep, I'm very sensitive to it. The allegations, the events described by Mr. Lopes in his lawsuit allegedly occurred in 2010 and 2011. I became mayor in 2014. I think that addressing the issue of diversity in city government has been one of our areas that we've spent a lot of time working in. Since January 2014, you know, our administration stands on its record. Nearly half of the people hired by the city have been from the city's minority community since I've been the mayor. Nearly half of the people hired at the DPW. Remember, the Lopes case was specific to the DPW. The Lopes case was specific to the hiring by the DPW. In the first 6 months that I was in office in 2014, one of the first personnel moves I made was I replaced the DPW commissioner. So I think a lot of this was addressed long before the Lopes verdict ever came to be. So we can speak to how we do things now, but I do think it's fair to judge us as to how, as a city and a community, we respond to this Lopes verdict. And that's why, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've brought in a lot of folks from the outside to come at this from a lot of different directions. And the Collins Center and UMass Boston is providing us with that thorough, top-to-bottom review of all personnel policies and practices, and going to make specific recommendations. And I've asked them to make specific recommendations around discriminatory hiring practices, along with diversity. And as I said, the UMass Boston's Chief Diversity Officer is part of that group that is conducting that study for us. I think on the legal side, all personal feelings aside, I think I have a responsibility to the taxpayers of the city to pursue every possible avenue to reduce or mitigate this $5 million judgment against the city. I think I have that financial responsibility to the taxpayers, and we're doing that. And we're doing that through the appeals process. And the solicitor has brought in a highly regarded appellate attorney with a lot of municipal and employment experience to lead that appeal, and that appeal is ongoing now. And then the third piece of this was that, you know, you gotta remember, when you go back and look at the jury's findings and the jury's awards, the vast majority of the money awarded was awarded for the retaliation claim, not for the discrimination claim. Now, I consider them both equally important, and we're addressing both of them with the same vigor, But it was really important that we take a look from someone independently from the outside. I think Attorney Prince and his firm's reputation and background is impeccable. And this is why, because there could be questions from the public, I didn't want this examination to be done from within. I wanted someone from the outside, someone with a prosecutorial background, someone with a background in employment law, someone that's highly regarded, to conduct this review independently, and that's their work is what's reflected in this report. And it is what it is, and there was no attempt to predetermine what it would turn out to be. It was going to go wherever it was going to go. This is where we ended up, with finding a lot of evidence, a lot of testimony and a lot of evidence that would point towards no retaliation.